Hey guys, my name is Matt and I'm a photographer and videographer here in Toronto, Ontario. Today we're going to get started with some fundamentals of photography and we're going to look at exposure. Exposure in photography terms is the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor, and it affects how bright or how dark your image is. When we talk about exposure, there's three main variables that you can change to make up an exposure: shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. So over the next three videos, we're going to jump into what those three things are. When we're talking about exposure, these three main variables make up the exposure triangle. If you're increasing your shutter speed, then it is going to decrease your exposure, or it's going to darken your image. To make up for that same exposure you had before you increase your shutter speed, you can either A, increase your ISO, or B, use a larger aperture. Exposure is measured in relative stops. So essentially, if you're increasing your exposure by one stop, you're doubling the amount of light that's coming into your camera sensor. However, if you're decreasing your exposure by one stop, you're essentially taking in half the amount of light that you did before. So now we're going to look at shutter speed and how that affects an exposure. Shutter speed is essentially the amount of time that your camera is taking a photo. Shutter speed is measured by seconds, so your shutter may be open for 1/250th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, maybe open for 15 seconds, and maybe open for 30 seconds. It's all measured in seconds. So when we talk about shutter speed and your camera is open for less than a second, yes, we're going to get into fractions of a second that your camera is open. For example, 1/25th of a second, 1/200th of a second, 1/400th of a second. So when you're going from 1/25th of a second to 1/200th of a second, yes, your camera is opening and closing much faster at 1/200th of a second than it is at 1/25th of a second. So when you look at the number on the bottom of the fraction, yes, we're talking about math. The higher the number on the bottom of the fraction, the quicker that your camera is taking a picture. So the faster your shutter speed is, the darker your image is going to be. Keeping everything else the same, if you're keeping your ISO the same, if you're keeping your aperture the same, when you're talking just shutter speed, if you are increasing your shutter speed, you're going to get a darker image, and if you're taking an image with a slower shutter speed, then you're going to get a lighter image. So just to show an example, I'm going to take a picture with this camera of a water bottle, and I'll show you some different shutter speeds and how it affects the brightness or darkness of an image. So for this example, I'm going to take a picture of a water bottle, which is right there on my coffee table. My ISO is going to be 800, which is going to stay the same in the next three pictures. My aperture is going to be 1.8, again staying the same, and we're only concentrating on shutter speed for now. So my shutter speed for this picture is going to be 1/60th of a second. So for the next photo, I'm going to change my shutter speed to 1/400th. So you'll see from the first photo to the second photo how much darker the second photo is by increasing the shutter speed or making your shutter faster. For the third photo, we're going to change our shutter speed. We're going to slow it down. So we're going to have our shutter at 1/40. Instead of 1/400. So it's going to be much slower shutter speed than 1/400, and it's going to be a much brighter image. I'm going to give you some general guidelines on using shutter speed in different situations like portraits, if you're trying to shoot a moving car, if you're trying to shoot a moving person, and really what you want to do creatively with shutter speed. For a portrait where someone is standing still, you could maybe use a shutter speed of somewhere between 1/80th up to 1/60th of a second. I mean, it really depends on your situation, but these are only some general guidelines of what you can use. I do shoot a number of weddings, so say if a bride is walking down the aisle, I'll generally go at 1/200, 1/200th of a second to keep the bride tack sharp, and no motion blur. If you're taking a photo of someone running and you want to have that picture tack sharp and you don't want to show any motion blur, then maybe starting around somewhere like 1/320th of a second, maybe up to 1/640th of a second. I mean, maybe if you're Usain Bolt or something, you might need a quicker shutter speed than that, but that's just my general recommendation. A good place to practice use of shutter speed would be out on the street, for example. You may have someone who is standing still, you may have someone that is walking down the sidewalk, you may have someone running down the sidewalk, and you'll also have moving cars as well. So you'll be able to look at 4, 5, or 6 different shutter speed situations and what shutter speed to use correctly. So it's great practice there. You can also use shutter speed to show motion or show motion blur and use it creatively. I might want to do something creatively where I use a longer exposure, like say 15 seconds or 30 seconds, where I want to show the motion of a car and I want to show those cool light beams going through my image. So I'll select a much slower shutter speed in that situation. That's it for today's video on exposure and shutter speed. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below. Hit the like button and please subscribe as well. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.